website, which you can access, and in fact, I encourage you all to go up there. There's a ton of information about BDS up there. It's bdsmovement.net. And if you go there, this is the logo that you see, and it has the initials of BDS. It has the call for freedom, justice, and equality. And some of you may know this character, others of you may not. That's Handala. Handala is the creation of Naji Al-Ali, who was a very famous Palestinian cartoonist and artist. And it was originally conceived, he was originally conceived as a 10-year-old Palestinian refugee from the 1948 ethnic cleansing of Palestine. We'll talk about that in a couple minutes. And he's always portrayed turned away from us with his hands behind his back in what Ali describes as a posture of defiance against injustice. And I just wanted to share with you something that he said. This is Naji Al-Ali. And here's something he said about Handala. Handala was born 10 years old, and he will always be 10 years old. At that age, I left my homeland, and when he returns, Handala will still be 10, and then he will start growing up. The laws of nature do not apply to him. He is unique. Things will become normal again when the homeland returns. And by the way, when he says he left his homeland, he was from a family that was driven out of Palestine in 1948. So if you go to the website, I think maybe the best place to start is with the words of what BDS says itself. What does it claim it is, and what does it claim it's doing? And so this is the overview that you can find on the site. It was written a couple of years ago. That 70 years should not be for nearly, it should now be read 71. But it says, for nearly 70 years, Israel has denied Palestinians their fundamental rights and has refused to comply with international law. Israel maintains a regime of settler colonialism, apartheid, and occupation over the Palestinian people. This is only possible because of international support. Governments fail to hold Israel to account, while corporations and institutions across the world help Israel to oppress Palestinians. Because those in power refuse to act to stop this injustice, Palestinian civil society has called for a global citizens' response of solidarity with the Palestinian struggle for freedom, justice, and equality. This was put out originally in the summer of 2005. In other words, it's a call from around 170 Palestinian civil society organizations, a call for the world to respond to the call for justice. I think that's an important place to start, because if you read the mainstream media in this country, you might often get the impression that BDS was started by a couple of rogue professors at universities here. And that's simply a lie. It is a call from Palestine and from the Palestinian people. Those of us here who support BDS. We support their call. And I think the next step, this sort of gives the overview of BDS as BDS describes it. The next step is to look at the three demands of BDS that comprise its platform. And again, in the words of what BDS itself says. And I think, by the way, the great thing about looking at demands is that they not only tell you what people are asking for, they tell you the nature of the injustice that's been perpetrated against them. So you learn what the problem is, and you learn what the remedies might be. So let's take a look at those demands. This is the intro to demands. The Palestinian BDS call urges nonviolent pressure on Israel until it complies with international law by meeting three demands. This is the first demand: ending its occupation and colonization of all Arab lands and dismantling the wall. So by ending the occupation and colonization of all Arab lands, BDS is referring to what's called the 1967 occupation: Gaza, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. That's the three areas that they have singled out as what they mean by the colonization of Arab lands. By the way, some of you may say, now wait a second, in 2005, didn't Israel withdraw from Gaza? They don't occupy Gaza anymore. That's not true. Yes, the soldiers left and the settlers left, but the definition of occupation in international law has nothing to do with your physical presence in an area. The definition is exercising control, effective control over a region over which you have no sovereignty. And by that definition, Israel still today occupies Gaza. The second half of this demand, dismantling the wall, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the wall. The Israelis call it the separation wall. In Arabic, it's referred to as the apartheid wall, which in our opinion, obviously much more accurately describes what it is. And that's what it looks like. I don't know if any of you have been to Palestine and seen this wall, but it's these large 10-meter slabs of concrete. Other places it is a fence. It's also called the separation fence. And then there are turrets and emplacements at various points. And then at other points, there are military checkpoints that stop people, Palestinians, from coming and going, right? And so the wall functions not only on sort of a daily level of creating misery for Palestinians trying to move around to their jobs and their homes, but it also functions as a symbol of Israeli apartheid. And by the way, you will often see if you go there, it's also become a canvas on the Palestinian side for resistance art. So there you see somebody pulling back the wall and letting in the view of the sea, which Palestinians used to have until they were ethnically cleansed and are no longer allowed back in, the refugees, that is. We'll talk about the refugees in a second. There's another example of the kind of resistance artwork that you see on the wall. The second demand is recognizing the fundamental rights of the Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel to full equality. Roughly 20%, I think now approaching 21%, of the citizens of Israel are not Jewish. They're Palestinian or other identities, and they are treated fundamentally as second-class citizens by law. There are over 65 laws in Israel that either directly or indirectly discriminate against Palestinian citizens. Also, one historical fact, for the first 19 years after the creation of the state, Palestinians who managed to remain in what is now called Israel were not even treated as second-class citizens. They were ruled under military law. In 1966, that changed when Israel, partly as part of a public relations campaign, conferred second-class citizenship on them. And one way of finding out about these laws, if you want to know the details and the facts of these laws, is to go to the Adala site. That's the Legal Center for Arab Minority Rights in Israel. And if you click on, I think it's the legal advocacy link, you find their discriminatory laws database, where they have kept a record of all of the the laws that discriminate against Palestinians. And in their own words, this is what they say. These laws limit the rights of Palestinians in all areas of life, from citizenship rights to the right of political participation, land and housing rights, education rights, culture and language rights, religious rights, and due process rights during detention. Some of the laws also discriminate against other groups such as gays, non-religious Jews, and Palestinian refugees, which again we'll talk about in a second. And then if you click on the actual database, there you get a whole list of the laws. And if you click on the law, it tells you what the law is, when it was initiated, how it functions, and how it, particularly in what ways it discriminates against Palestinian citizens. And they make a point that some of the laws are what they call discrimination on its face, meaning the law itself describes what the discrimination is. In other cases, the law, it's neutral language to the law, but in fact, the de facto application of the law is to discriminate against non-Jewish citizens. And perhaps the biggest sort of reification or reaffirmation of this apartheid structure of Israel was the passage last year in July of 2018 of the nation-state law, as it's called. And this law, which was pushed by the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, declared that Israel is the state of one people and one people only. Not the Israeli people, which is what we would expect any country to say, but the Jewish people. So even though 20% of the population is not Jewish, and even though they're citizens, they do not belong to the nation. And if you extrapolate that to this country, that would be as if 60 million Americans were told, you're citizens, but this nation isn't yours. You don't belong to it. And then the third demand is respecting, protecting, and promoting the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and properties as stipulated in UN Resolution 194. And of course, there's a whole historical discussion that could go on here now. This is going to be a very quick slice of that discussion. But when Israel was established in 1948, there was the majority of the population were not Jewish. It was Arab. Arab non-Jews comprised the majority of the population. This conflicted with the idea of a Jewish state that the soon-to-be Israeli settlers envisioned. And when they said Jewish state, they didn't just mean a state where Jewish people lived. They didn't mean a place where Jewish people lived with full equality for everybody. Because if that were the definition of a Jewish state, SOMA could qualify. I'm Jewish, I live here, and I'm treated full equality under the law. They had something different in mind. One where there was an overwhelming majority of the population was Jewish, and where Jewish people would control the state in the name of Jews worldwide. That they encountered, obviously, a big obstacle. Most of the people living there were not Jewish. So there was a campaign to drive out the maximum number of non-Jews that they could effectively remove. The number, according to, depends where you look, but it's usually considered between 750 and 850,000 people. And that is referred to in Arabic as the Nakba, or catastrophe. In English, that's a very famous picture of Palestinian refugees fleeing the fighting. The UN passed a resolution 194, which required their return, which reaffirmed their inalienable right to return to their homes. Israel has been denying that right since 1948. So we're now in the 71st year. And some of you may remember last year, you might have heard of something called the Great Return March. In the media here, it was talked about as a conflict between Hamas and Israel, which is a complete misrepresentation. Overwhelmingly, the citizens, the residents of Gaza, are either refugees from the 1948 Nakba or are descendants of those refugees. And this was a grassroots movement on the part of those refugees to take right of return, their inalienable right of return, into their own hands. And they organized a grassroots campaign to march to the border, to march to the fence, the separation fence, and attempt, some of them, to actually climb over and say, we are returning. Some of them were shot dead by the Israelis for doing that. The key, you may have seen, has become a very powerful symbol of right of return. Palestinians will tell you, we still have the keys to the front doors to our houses that we were expelled from in 1948, and they still hold on to the keys. So you'll see a lot of artwork and a lot of documentation has Palestinians holding their keys. This is Lamise Deek. Some of you may know Lamise. She was originally supposed to speak here. Unfortunately, she wasn't feeling well, so she couldn't make it. But this is her speaking in the city, and she has said a great thing about the right of return. The right to return is the right to remain, the idea of remaining on your homeland that way. Lastly, I just want to say that the BDS campaign is itself based on earlier boycott campaigns, highly respected campaigns that many of us participated in. And three that come to mind are the boycott campaign against South Africa, apartheid South Africa. The middle one is not a poster, that is black working people walking to work during the Montgomery bus boycott, honoring not taking the bus, but boycotting the bus company and walking to work. And this is when I remember growing up in California. This was the first political campaign I got involved in. My parents didn't drag me to. It was the United Farm Workers boycott grapes and boycott iceberg lettuce, neither of which I could eat until I was about 43. Just the thought of eating grapes and iceberg lettuce was so embedded in me, you weren't supposed to do that because of the boycott. And what all these boycotts, including BDS against apartheid Israel, have in common is they all generated from the people who are actually suffering from the oppression. They all single out the perpetrator of the injustice, and they all propose remedies for restorative justice. And I just want to end, before we move on, with one thought that I had putting together this presentation. I've never seen anything like this in the mainstream media of this country. The Sunday Times magazine has never done anything like this. I've never seen a 60 Minutes segment where they talk about this. In fact, I did a little experiment before this event. I went online and found as many anti-BDS articles as I could find in a couple of scans on Google. And I came up with 22 articles. 20 of them did not mention a single thing covered in this presentation, including what the three demands of BDS are in the first place. They are not even mentioned. They're not even mentioned to dispute them. They are simply ignored. One of them mentioned the 21st article mentioned the 67 occupation, and the 22nd article mentioned the refugee situation. But 20 out of 22 articles didn't mention anything having to do with this. And so just to wrap up, what I'll say is that made me question why. Why is that? I mean, if you think these things are wrong or untrue, wouldn't you want to make a huge point about that? Wouldn't you want to bring it up at every opportunity? You'd want to challenge it. And I think, and this is my opinion, that the reason that this is not challenged is because supporters or enablers of apartheid Israel either know or intuit that they have no answer for this. They can't deny it as history because it's true. And they can't refute it morally because it is just. And so that leaves them two options. Either to ignore the truth in the hopes it will go away, or to attack the truth in the hopes that they can silence people advocating for it. And on that note, that sounds like a good transition to Alexander, who's going to talk to us. Do you want me to read your bio for everybody?
No.
No?
I'll tell them everything they need to know.
Okay, and let me just put that there. And there we go.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So my name is Alex Shalom. I am a lawyer at the American Civil Liberties Union of New Jersey, and I live in South Orange. I think that's kind of the critical things you need to know. I will say, one thing I was thinking about when David was talking is I had a very different reaction to the Boycott Great campaign, which is to say I think a little younger than David, so this was imposed on me by my parents. And when United Farm Workers lifted the boycott and said, go ahead and have green grapes, I dug in and I thought there had never been a sweeter fruit I had ever tasted than the first time I had a green grape, and it really blew my mind. So I am here, I told you I'm a South Orange resident, but I'm here in my capacity as a lawyer for the ACLU, and let me just be totally clear, the ACLU takes no position on BDS. So what I'm here to talk to you about is not everything David just talked about, but instead a series of laws that have been proposed and enacted varyingly around the country designed to attack BDS, about which the ACLU has grave concerns, and I think you all should too, whether or not you support BDS. And so I have lots of friends who are avid Zionists and also think these laws are incredibly dangerous. And so let me just, here's my plan. I'm going to talk about the laws. I'm going to focus first on the law that passed in New Jersey, but I'll talk about some of the laws on the federal level and in other states. I'm going to tell you what my concerns are, what the ACLU's concerns are, both constitutionally and as a matter of policy. I'm going to tell you about some of the legal challenges and tell you about what some of the obstacles are to bringing other legal challenges. And obviously, I'm happy to take questions at any point. So, New Jersey passed a law in, gosh, I think it was 2016, called, yeah, it was definitely 2016, S-1923. And it had lots of policy statements about why New Jersey didn't like BDS, but the policy statements were just that. They were policy statements. What the law did is it said that effectively no company that supported BDS could be invested in by the Department of Pensions. The pension fund could not invest in any company that supported BDS. It called for, and that was true whether they supported all of the demands of BDS, some of the demands, any of the demands, they would be singled out to not be invested in. And it called for the State Investment Council and the director of the Division of Investment, not a group I'm totally familiar with, but the people in charge of the pensions, to conduct investigations to figure out what companies supported BDS. And it included, among the tools they were required to utilize, the retention of an independent research firm to identify companies that boycott Israel. Okay, so that's the New Jersey law. There's one other variant. Other states have similar versions in their state, and then another variant is to say we're going to do that, this kind of anti-pension investment piece, and what we're going to do is we're going to make a requirement that government contractors must sign an oath that says, I do not participate in BDS. And when we think of government contractors, my first thought is like, subcontractors and big companies. But in fact, I'll tell you about what's happened in some places. In Kansas, a woman was a teacher, like a senior teacher, and she had been appointed to be a teacher trainer, to run teacher trainings for the state. So she was going to get some money from the state to do other teacher trainings. That required her to be a state contractor. Her church participated in the BDS movement, and she did not believe in good conscience she could sign the affirmation that she wouldn't participate. So she is a single person, or a single family, not a huge economic powerhouse that's churning through Kansas, but she, didn't buy Sabra hummus or whatever her contribution to BDS was. That was enough to prohibit her from going to this teacher training. In Texas, a lawsuit was just filed on behalf of 4 people, 2 of whom their contracting with the state of Texas was that they were going to judge debate competitions, and there was some travel honorarium associated with it. So those are, in many ways, or in all ways, frankly, more problematic even than the law that New Jersey passed. And I'm going to tell you about one more, and then I'm going to tell you why I think they're so problematic. You may have heard that S1, the first bill that the new Senate voted on, that dealt after the shutdown, that dealt with lots of important things, right? It's the first bill, dealt with kind of supporting states that enact these anti-BDS laws. So it was this bill that was proposed and had tons and tons of co-sponsors. Included among co-sponsors was Senator Booker, our Senator Cory Booker. And then, so what the bill basically said is we're removing a federal preemption defense against these suits. It's boring lawyer stuff, but basically, normally, the federal government gets to decide when we boycott countries, right? None of us can do business with Iran, with North Korea, with other places, because the federal government has prohibited that. And so the essential argument is they make the decision and we're not going to subcontract that to states or counties or so forth. That's the argument. Who knows whether it would win? And the S1 removes that argument. After the concerns were raised, 21, I believe, senators voted no on the bill, which means 79 voted yes. Included among the senators who voted no on the bill was Cory Booker, one of the sponsors of the bill. So that's not the usual, right, how a bill becomes a law. It's usually not that a sponsor withdraws his support. Just so you all know, so the bill passed, it's on to the House. I'm going to tell you how every senator who's running for president, who's announced that he or she is running for president, voted, because it's vaguely interesting. So Booker, Sherrod Brown, who hasn't yet announced, Kirsten Gillibrand, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren voted no. Amy Klobuchar voted yes. Rand Paul, who ran for president last time, voted no. Bob Menendez voted yes. I know he's not running for president, but I'm giving you the New Jersey angle. So that's the federal law. Let me talk a little bit about what the concerns are. I'm going to start, I think the concerns with the, whatever we might want to call it, loyalty oath piece is more palpable. I'm not even going to talk about that. Let me focus on what our constitutional concerns are with the New Jersey law, the idea that pensions would choose where they invest based on these political statements. The first concern here is, and really what's at the heart of what animates the ACLU's concern, is that this is punishing not behavior of where you choose to spend your money, but speech. And I spent some time a minute ago talking to Rabbi Ortz, and I think I did a bad job explaining it, so hopefully you were my warm-up act, and I can do a better job explaining it here. We all, I think, let me not assume, I believe that the effort to divest from South Africa was both morally appropriate and highly effective, right? I think the reason that the apartheid regime fell in South Africa, in part, was because of international isolation, including economic isolation. So if we assume that it's okay to say you can't use South African gold, right? Isn't that a big export from South Africa? Any other exports we can use? But let's say gold. You can't buy South African gold under any circumstances. We are going to both prevent the people who want to use South African gold because it's the shiniest, and people who want to use South African gold because they support apartheid. They're both equally prohibited from participating in commerce with South Africa. So we're not making the question of whether they can do it based on why they want to do it, but what they are going to do. Are you going to invest in South Africa? If the answer is yes, you can't do it. That's what those laws said. Unlike that, what anti-BDS laws don't compel companies to do business with Israel, right? There's 185 countries in the world, and some people will buy their widgets from Israel, and some people will buy their widgets from Jordan or Canada or the United States, right? You might have no import-export. Let's not use widgets, let's use figs, right? Israeli figs. And so imagine two different companies that could buy Israeli figs, but instead choose to buy Jordanian figs. Company one says, I am not buying Israeli figs because I think Jordanian figs are juicier. I like them more. The pension would have no problem with that choice. That's right, that's business, that's taste, that's whatever. Godspeed. The other company says, I want to buy Jordanian figs, even though I like Israeli figs, because I don't like Israel's politics. I think Israel should get out of Gaza, should get out of the West Bank, should leave the Golan Heights, and therefore I'm going to buy Jordanian figs. That company would be punished. The first company wouldn't. They're both doing the same, making the same business choice to buy Jordanian rather than Israeli figs. So it is the speech of the second company that is being punished. Their political intent rather than their action. The ACLU has for 50 years or so advocated for the right to boycott, whether that's in Montgomery or elsewhere, because it is a powerful tool for people without a lot of political power to use their economic wherewithal to essentially shop where they want to shop and send powerful political messages. This is the same for us. And then the question is, what chilling effect will it have? And so clearly, if a company wants to be invested in, have the pension to invest in them, which we assume companies do, companies of certain size at least do, they're not, if they want that to happen, they're not going to announce why they don't want Israeli figs, right? If they'll hope that people assume it's because they think the Jordanian ones are juicier, but that also prevents them from telling their story and encouraging their friends. But also, let's remember, companies don't speak. Individuals speak. Sometimes they speak for companies, and sometimes they speak on their own. But imagine a public company. If the public company says, we are going to choose to buy Jordanian figs, but the CEO says, I think we should support, I support BDS, I would never buy anything in Israel, I think it's a terrible government, that private investigator who's mandated to be hired by the state is going to certainly be wondering, curious, and maybe they get onto a list. And then so what if it's not the CEO? What if it's a member of the board? What if it's a 20-person board and 19 people are going to the APAC conference, but one person supports BDS publicly? How do you measure that? What if it's an employee? At what level are we saying that it is the company's choice, the company's speech, and what sort of invasive searches are going to be involved in trying to make these political determinations? And what do we want? Are we comfortable with the government databasing our political beliefs? I will give you my answer. I am not comfortable with the government databasing my political beliefs. Whether those beliefs are popular or unpopular, I just don't think that's the role for government. So, a couple things. I think I've tried to at least explain why it's politically, constitutionally easy for a government to say, we are choosing not to invest in that state. So, for example, lots of states, I don't know if New Jersey did in the end, but New York certainly did, when various states passed these horrible anti-transgender bills in the last couple of years, so Indiana under Mike Pence was one of them, New York then prohibited its state employees from traveling on government business to Indiana. And so that's a classic boycott. We're saying to Indiana, there is a political, an economic consequence to your politics. And what that meant was a New Yorker couldn't go to Indiana to an anti-trans rally, but it also meant you couldn't go to Indiana to a basketball tournament. I mean, for state business, obviously you could still travel on your own. But you were prohibited regardless of the reason. And that doesn't then require that sort of inquiry into what people are thinking and why they think it. But I want to make another point, and it's super important, because at the same time that the ACLU is a longtime supporter both of boycotts and First Amendment rights in general, the right to free speech and association in general, we're also supporters of anti-discrimination laws. We think anti-discrimination laws are appropriate. New Jersey's anti-discrimination law, called the Law Against Discrimination, prohibits discrimination based on national origin. And so if what the BDS movement said was, we're not going to buy from Jews, obviously, but even if it said we won't buy from Israelis wherever they live, that would be forbidden by the law against discrimination, and we would oppose that. That's not what the BDS movement says. It says we're not going to buy from Israel. So if you have an Israeli business owner in New Jersey, an Israeli business owner in London, wherever, to choose not to shop there because they're Israeli is discrimination based on nationality. To choose not to support a business based in Israel is not discrimination based on nationality. That is the kind of classic political distinction. Okay, challenges. So these laws started cropping up probably in about 2015, 14 to 16, somewhere around there, and almost immediately the challenges began. So some of the laws were proposed, and lawyers wrote letters saying this law is unconstitutional, and the legislature backed off. In other places, they did not. So I told you about Kansas with the teacher. In Arizona, there was a lawyer who was a sole practitioner, and in his personal capacity, he participated in the BDS movement. He wanted his law firm, which was, Joe Smith LLP. It was the same thing, just the corporate version of it, to also participate, but he had a contract to represent people in the jail, and he couldn't do that if his business entity supported BDS. So ACLU lawsuits were filed in Kansas, Arizona, Texas, and Arkansas. The Texas one is the most recent one. It was filed on December 18th of last year, so just 2 months ago. On January 20th is to really intrude into what people are thinking, what people are saying, and that is the kind of exactly what the First Amendment is supposed to protect us against. And so there will be future challenges. One obstacle to challenges, forthrightly, is that you need to have what's called standing, which is a person who is affected. And so take the example. In order to bring a challenge, you need someone to get banned from the participation in the pension, and most folks aren't going to wave their hand and volunteer for that job. So there might be some ways around it, but that's that. And so last obstacle is there have been a series of cases from the Supreme Court that have said, listen, the government gets to choose its own speech as well. And New Jersey can basically vote with its wallet. It can say what it supports and what it doesn't support based on where it invests. And we think that's true. But what we do is bad politics or reward good politics. But when it's the speech itself that it targets is when it gets particularly dangerous. So I'm going to turn it over these folks to talk more about BDS, and I'm going to stick around for the Q&A part. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, I am gonna read a couple of brief bios here. So, two co-founders of SOMA for Palestine, John Gordon, Leila Saad. Leila is a Palestinian American whose father is a Palestinian refugee from Haifa in what is now Israel. She studied issues to do with the Palestinian question as a graduate student, especially focusing on U.S. economic, political, and military support for Israel. Leila is a freelance writer and editor and lives in Maplewood with her husband and 3 children. John Gordon is a Palestinian American whose mother is a 1948 Palestinian refugee from Jaffa. He is resident of Maplewood with his wife and 2 children. Take it away.
Thank you, David. We're gonna go through a few questions, sort of the main points to cover SOMA for Palestine and BDS. We're just gonna ask each other and respond to them, and then we'll open up for Q&A afterwards. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I just want to say we're standing in for Lamise Deek, who you saw in that picture. I don't think we'll do the topic justice in the way she could have, but bear with us. We're going to try to keep it conversational, and then we'll open up to questions, and we look forward to that.
So I'll start with the first question. So Leila, can you please tell the audience about the BDS resolution that was originally proposed and prompted you and all of us to start the group SOMA for Palestine?
So what happened is about a year ago, in our township, this is Maplewood, the next town over is South Orange, and the two towns are sister towns. We call them SOMA for short, or MAPSO. And so, there's a debate about that, but that's a hot topic, so we're not covering that today. So a group of people came to our township committee, the Maplewood Township Committee. They had gone to a number of other towns around here and applied to those township committees and asked them to pass a resolution to condemn BDS. And it actually passed in a couple of townships nearby here. So they came to Maplewood, maybe unwittingly, not knowing that there were some Palestinian Americans living in this town, some activists living around here who would care about this issue. And they went to the township committee and asked that it pass this resolution to condemn BDS. It wasn't like a binding resolution. It wasn't like one of the state resolutions or the federal law or anything like that. But it was sort of a statement that they wanted the township committee to get behind. And when we found out about that, a bunch of us got together. We started talking. We started, talking about how we wanted to respond. And we wrote a letter, got a number of residents to sign it, and then went to the township committee meeting and explained why we thought they should not accept the resolution or pass the resolution. And we won. It's a little victory, but we'll take it as a victory. I think the most important thing is that we sent a message that there are people who are interested in this topic in this town. There are people who are happily pro-Palestinian and happy to talk about this topic, and that there are so many of us too who care about the free speech issue that Alex talked about. So for all those reasons, we think it makes, it sort of represented our town perfectly.
Yeah, I can add, and since then we've had a couple programs. This is, I think, our third official event to discuss these issues. Our first event was here at the library. It was a Black Palestinian Solidarity event, and we had a local minister, Niall Fort, who grew up in Maplewood, South Orange area, and a Palestinian, Fatin Gerard was here as well. And so we're trying to have these events to educate everyone who doesn't know as much about these issues and to present our position on these, because as already was stated, our position is not in the mainstream media as Palestinians, and we want people to hear our voice as well.
So our little conversation, we're not going to talk about the legal side of these issues. We're going to talk about the moral, ethical reason why we're supporting BDS in the first place, why we think everybody should be supporting BDS, and what we see it bringing about. So on that note, John, can you talk about the three demands of the BDS movement? Ending the occupation, ending apartheid, and the right of return for refugees, and especially why is it so important? Why is the right of return for refugees probably the most important of those demands?
Well, I wanted to say that these demands, while they're the demands of BDS, they've honestly been the demands of Palestinians since the very beginning. It's been, as David said, 71 years since the Nakba in 1948. And my family left in 1948. And my grandfather spent his whole life fighting for these issues. So the BDS is really just a formulation, or like I was saying before, a strategy to have a strategy to implement these demands through boycott, divestment, and sanctions. So the right of return is very important to, there's refugees, Palestinian refugees all around historic Palestine and the neighboring countries here in the US and all over the world. And it's the law that they have the right to return.
towns, and as you know, expelling people, 750,000 as far as we know, maybe more. And the house next door to my parents' house, next door to my father's house, was bombed, and a small child was killed. And so his family said, that's it, we have to leave, and they fled for the border of Lebanon. And they were never allowed back since then. Even when my dad's uncle had appendicitis and needed to be rushed to the hospital, they couldn't get back, and so he died. And anyway, this is one story among so many stories. This is almost like an easy story, actually, because my dad was lucky enough that his father spoke English, they went to Lebanon, he found a job, they flourished relatively for Palestinians in Lebanon. That's another story. That was a difficult life too, because there are Lebanese who discriminated against Palestinians. But the point is, many others lived so much more difficult lives in refugee camps. And that's what the right of return is about. That's why BDS talks about it, because there's no fair or just solution to this problem until Israel recognizes, and the United States, frankly, recognizes that all of those people who've been displaced, all of their descendants, not to mention all those who were displaced in the 1967 occupations of Gaza and Jerusalem and the West Bank, are all allowed to return home and live in dignity, equality, and justice in their homeland.
So Leila, if BDS were to be successful in its demands, what would it look like? How does BDS, and what do you envision for the future? Is it a one-state solution, a two-state solution, or something else altogether?
It's clear to me, and I don't know that the BDS movement technically talks about this, but it's clear to me that if every Palestinian refugee was allowed the right to return to their homeland, there would no longer be a Jewish state. And that is not because we're calling for the destruction of anybody, as some people like to say. It's because you would then have a situation, whether it was one state, whether it was two states, whether it was 3 states or more, you'd have a situation where everybody was given equal rights under the law. Everybody is allowed to live in the same territory, and nobody's occupied. In this case, we're talking about the demand of BDS to end the occupation. There wouldn't be a government occupying another person's land, but they would all be living in dignity and equality together. So there are a lot of us in this movement, and probably in this room, who support a one-state solution. I actually say that it really doesn't matter whether it's 1 state, 2 state, or 18 states. The point is the same. When you have the right of return for people, when you have the end of the occupation of the 1967 territories, and when you have an end to the apartheid laws in Israel that discriminate against non-Jewish citizens and prioritize the rights of Jewish citizens over them, when you get rid of all of that, you have democracy, equality. You don't have segregation any longer. You don't have a separate but equal situation that us Americans know so much about. So that's what I think you'd have if the BDS movement were successful, and frankly, I think that's what you will have one day. So John, BDS co-founder Omar Barghouti has said, accepting modern-day Jewish Israelis as equal citizens and full partners in building and developing a new shared society, free from all colonial subjugation and discrimination, as called for in the democratic state model, is the most magnanimous, rational offer any oppressed indigenous population could present to its oppressors. So don't ask for more. Can you talk about that?
I think this is touching on also what you were just saying before, that a shared equal society where people have equal rights, the rights to vote and the rights to be represented, and self-determination for their families and their people. That's a great solution to this problem. I think anything less is you're at the situation where some people have more rights than others, and discrimination is basically the rule of law. That's unacceptable. That's unacceptable in any democratic society. So how could you not have a democratic society with everyone with equal representation, equal voice? No one should be more important than another person and have more rights and more benefits than another person. We all should be equal. It's the basis of any government in the world should be this way. Not all governments in the world are this way, of course, but we should be.
And I just want to add that I think the BDS movement is calling for the bare minimum, right? And I think that's sort of the argument that, or the point of this quote is that at a bare minimum, we're talking about throwing off the yoke of colonialism. I mean, this is like, it's hard to argue this in this day and age because Israel, and especially in the United States, although I don't think that's true everywhere in the world. I think there are a lot of places in the world where this conversation is not a dangerous one, it's not a scary one, and it's not one that's going to be condemned or silenced, right? So that's one thing to remember. If you're on the side of BDS, don't feel alone. You might in the US when you're here, you might feel that, right? It might feel kind of like, I'm the only one thinking this, but I'd say the majority of the world's population is on your side. But my point is that, this is about ending a settler colonial occupation of another people's lands. We've been through that, right? And we've overcome it. We overcame it in Algeria, and we overcame it in South Africa, the prime example, because BDS and the Palestinian people look to the South African people for strength and for tactics and for strategies and ways to represent themselves and get the support of the world's people on their side. But we've overcome colonialism in Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. We've overcome settler colonialism around the world, and during that movement, that movement of the 60s and 70s especially, when we were fighting those fights, there was a new kind of settler colonialism that became more powerful than ever before. And Israel is a prime example of that. South Africa too, but since things have at least changed enough in South Africa, not to the point that we all want them to, but at least legally things have changed enough. But in Israel, Israel continued to argue that for its own self-determination, right? That there should be a land for a certain people, an ethno-religious state for the Jewish people, whether they consider themselves ethnically alike or religiously alike. That's what they're asking for. They're asking for a state for themselves. But that's not the same thing as anti-colonial liberation. In this case, the settler colonists are supported by the world's powers, right? That's how Israel was established in the first place. Israel was established under the arm of the British Empire. And it's been held closely safeguarded, particularly since 1967, by the warmth of the United States, the world's superpower. So it's not the same kind of liberation movement that you see elsewhere. It's not the same kind of self-determination movement that you see elsewhere. The anti-colonial liberation movement in this case is the Palestinians. And that's why you have the support of the world's people, I think, on their side.
I think just to add to that, there's many nations that were under colonialism or still are to some effect, and there's a lot of ripple effects of colonialism, and colonialism is a system that needs to end for everybody because it just puts down people's rights. I mean, Puerto Rico is a perfect example of how the United States has control over Puerto Rico, and they don't have control of their own destiny in many cases. Especially we've seen what's been going on the past few years. Haiti is suffering from all kinds of actions that the U.S. is taking, and they're keeping behind the scenes, just like the actions they take against the Palestinians behind the scenes. So we see these things happening in many nations, and we're definitely in solidarity with those nations as Palestinians.
And our movement is, I think, probably more powerful for it, for all of us together. Which leads us to our next question.
Yes.
Conveniently.
Leila, many prominent people of color, Representatives Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, Professor Mark Lamont Hill, Dr. Angela Davis, have recently come under attack for supporting BDS. Why are activists of color particularly vulnerable to these attacks? And SOMA for Palestine held another event, which we mentioned, a Black Palestinian Solidarity for Freedom and Justice for Both Peoples. Can you please talk about that?
Yeah, and I'll talk about maybe the second part of the question first. So we held that event here in the Maplewood Library. It was a fantastic event with Niall Ford, a minister from Newark, and a Palestinian activist from New York with Al-Awda. And the idea there, and in all of the, in other words, it's not just happening here in Maplewood. This has been a larger movement where Black activists and Palestinian activists have been coming together, supporting one another, and sharing ideas and sharing support and strategies too for how to bring about the justice and freedom for both of those people and all other subjugated and colonized and occupied people around the world. But there's something particular about those two, and I think it was, sort of notably sparked around the time of Ferguson, when there were a lot of black activists out in the streets, and Palestinians were sending them messages of support on Twitter and elsewhere, and giving them very practical advice even about, when you get tear gas, pour milk in your eyes. And black activists were running to the store and buying milk and bringing it with them to protests, knowing that that would protect them. And then I think there were a number of black activists who started traveling to Palestine to visit and see what it was like in the occupied territories and to speak to Palestinians and hear about what they've been going through. And Palestinians in turn were talking to black activists and finding out about conditions in the United States and how to support them better. And the Black Lives Matter, or the Movement for Black Lives Matter, formally adopted as part of their platform support for the BDS movement. And that was probably the most controversial part of their platform, that they supported Palestinian rights, which is crazy, right? Because here we are, innocent black men are getting killed in the streets. The police are just closing in on each other to protect themselves. So it's clear that state power is not interested in the Black Lives Matter movement, but the thing that they got the most flack for was their support for Palestine. And I think that's why you see, that has something to do with why you see these prominent and outspoken and smart and intelligent and courageous and proud people like Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, you mentioned Angela Davis, Mark Lamont Hill, who've been attacked viciously for supporting Palestinian rights and for supporting BDS or supporting the end to the occupation, the right of return, all these things that are just sort of basic, the very basic under international law and frankly human decency. And when they speak up for these things, they get attacked, even more viciously. You're always open to attack as a person of color who's vocal about rights issues, and I think combine that with speaking up about Palestinian rights, and you're doubly targeted.
And we should mention Michelle Alexander coming up.
And Michelle Alexander too, yeah. So we want to talk at the end, before we turn it over to questions, about the best ways for us as activists, concerned citizens, to respond to critics of BDS. And I'll start if you don't mind. We can go through all the sort of main criticisms of the BDS movement, but before I do that, I just want to say that I think the number one most powerful thing you can do to respond to those criticisms is to know that you're right. Know that you stand on the side of justice. know that you stand on the right side of history, and know that what you're standing for are the very least that we could ask for under international law. For human rights, we're asking for equality, for justice, for dignity. We're against colonialism, we're against imperialism. There's nothing to be ashamed in any of those things. You should only feel that you're right about those things. You have people around you. You may not always feel like that in the United States, but you should feel really, really certain about that, even when people get attacked, and even when it's uncomfortable or it can be difficult to talk about those things. And then secondly, I would say, I think the most important thing for us to do is to not get drawn into those arguments. Because the attacks of anti-Semitism, probably the foremost, but the attacks, I'd say that is the foremost